Every avoidant relationship follows the same tragic trajectory toward an inevitable breaking point that arrives not with dramatic confrontation or explosive conflict, but with the quiet, devastating moment when their partner finally stops fighting for connection and accepts the emotional limitations that the avoidant has spent months or years demonstrating through their behavior. This breaking point represents the death of hope rather than the birth of anger, the exhaustion of love rather than its transformation into hatred, the peaceful surrender of someone who has finally learned that you cannot force intimacy with someone determined to avoid it. The avoidant, who has become an expert at surviving relationship storms, managing emotional crises, and deflecting attempts at deeper connection, finds themselves completely unprepared for this final breaking point because it arrives without warning, without demands, without the familiar drama they've learned to navigate through emotional distance and strategic withdrawal. Their partner simply stops trying, stops hoping, stops believing that enough love, patience, or understanding can bridge the gap between what they need and what the avoidant is capable of providing. This moment represents the ultimate failure of the avoidance relationship strategy, proving that their sophisticated emotional management techniques work only as long as their partner remains willing to participate in the exhausting dance of pursuit and withdrawal that has characterized their connection. When their partner exits this dance entirely, when they stop responding to emotional breadcrumbs with grateful appreciation, when they choose dignity over devotion, the avoidant discovers that all their defensive strategies have been building toward this moment of absolute loss. The breaking point reveals the cruel irony at the heart of avoidant attachment. Their fear of intimacy creates the very abandonment they're trying to prevent. Their defensive strategies destroy the relationships they're designed to protect. And their sophisticated emotional management ultimately manages to eliminate the very love they desperately need, but are too terrified to receive authentically. The moment, the pattern, finally breaks. The pattern that has sustained the avoidant relationship for months or years, the cycle of pursuit and withdrawal, crisis and reconciliation, emotional hunger and strategic withholding, finally breaks when their partner reaches a psychological threshold where continuing to participate in this dynamic feels more damaging than walking away from the relationship entirely. This moment arrives not through conscious decision, but through the gradual accumulation of disappointments that eventually overwhelm their capacity to maintain hope for change or growth within the existing framework. The breaking occurs when their partner recognizes that the avoidance emotional limitations are not temporary obstacles to be overcome through patience and understanding, but permanent features of their personality that will never change enough to create the mutual intimacy and reciprocal emotional investment that healthy relationships require. This recognition transforms love from a renewable resource into a finite commodity that has finally been depleted through consistent misuse and systematic undervaluation. Understanding this moment means recognizing that it represents the partner's psychological evolution from someone who believes love can heal attachment wounds to someone who understands that healing requires willing participation from the wounded person. They stop trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved, stop offering emotional medicine to someone who refuses to swallow it, stop providing solutions to problems the avoidant would rather manage than resolve. The pattern breaks when their partner's nervous system finally adapts to the reality that emotional safety cannot be found with someone whose primary relationship strategy involves creating emotional danger through withdrawal, withholding, and systematic undermining of connection attempts. Their body begins to relax when they step away from the constant stress of trying to earn love from someone determined not to give it freely. This breaking point often appears deceptively quiet and undramatic, characterized more by absence than presence. the absence of pursuit after the avoidant's withdrawal, the absence of anxiety when the avoidant creates distance, the absence of effort to bridge gaps that the avoidant deliberately creates to maintain their sense of control and emotional safety. The partner simply stops dancing the exhausting choreography that has defined their connection. The moment becomes irreversible when their partner's emotional investment shifts from the relationship to their own healing and recovery from the chronic stress, anxiety, and self-doubt that living with an avoidant has created. They begin to prioritize their own emotional well-being over the relationship's continuation, choosing self-preservation over self-sacrifice for someone who has consistently demonstrated their inability to appreciate or reciprocate genuine emotional investment. Most significantly, the pattern breaks when their partner stops interpreting the avoidant's defensive behaviors as evidence of hidden love and starts recognizing them as evidence of emotional limitations that make genuine intimacy impossible. They cease translating withdrawal as fear and begin experiencing it as rejection, stop reading distance as protection, and start seeing it as emotional abandonment. The breaking often coincides with their partner's realization that they have been participating in a relationship with someone's potential rather than their reality, loving an imaginary version of the avoidant who could heal and grow rather than accepting the actual person who consistently chooses defensive strategies over authentic connection. This recognition eliminates the future focus that has sustained their investment and forces them to evaluate the relationship based on present reality rather than hopeful projections. Understanding this pattern break reveals why it often surprises the avoidant, who has become accustomed to their partner's resilience and capacity to maintain hope despite repeated disappointments. They expect the familiar cycle to continue indefinitely, not recognizing that every cycle weakens their partner's investment until it finally reaches the point where continuing feels impossible rather than difficult. The tragedy of this moment lies in how it represents the natural conclusion of the avoidant's own choices and behaviors, the inevitable outcome of their consistent prioritization of emotional safety over authentic connection, the logical result of their systematic training of their partner to expect disappointment rather than reciprocity from someone they've loved with devastating generosity and patience. When their partner stops fighting for the relationship, the avoidant experiences their partner's cessation of fighting as a psychological earthquake that fundamentally alters the landscape of their emotional world, eliminating the familiar dynamic where their withdrawal was met with increased pursuit and their distance generated desperate attempts to restore connection. When their partner stops fighting for the relationship, the avoidant discovers they've lost not just someone who loved them, but their primary source of validation that they were worth fighting for despite their emotional unavailability and systematic relationship sabotage. This moment represents the collapse of the avoidant's entire relationship framework, which depends on their partner's willingness to compensate for their emotional limitations through increased effort, understanding, and patient pursuit of someone who has consistently demonstrated their inability to reciprocate such investment. When their partner stops providing this compensatory emotional labor, the avoidant faces the stark reality that relationships require mutual effort rather than one-sided devotion. Understanding this cessation means recognizing that it emerges not from anger or resentment, but from exhaustion and acceptance, as their partner finally acknowledges that fighting for someone who doesn't fight for themselves or the relationship represents a form of emotional self-harm that must end for their own psychological survival. The fighting stops not because love dies, but because the fighter finally chooses self-preservation over relationship preservation. The partner's withdrawal from fighting often manifests as peaceful indifference rather than hostile rejection, creating a silence that the avoidant finds more terrifying than any argument or emotional confrontation they've previously navigated. This calm detachment signals that their partner has moved beyond hope for change into acceptance of reality, beyond trying to fix what cannot be repaired, into protecting themselves from further emotional damage. When their partner stops fighting, the avoidant loses their most reliable source of emotional regulation and stability, discovering that their psychological equilibrium depended heavily on someone else's willingness to manage the emotional chaos their defensive strategies consistently created. The absence of their partner's fighting reveals how much they relied on external effort to maintain internal balance while contributing minimal emotional labor themselves. This cessation also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain their comfortable position as the pursued party who graciously tolerates their partner's emotional neediness and relationship demands. When their partner stops making demands, stops expressing needs, stops pursuing connection, the avoidant can no longer position themselves as the reasonable party, managing an unreasonable partner's excessive emotional requirements. Most devastatingly, when their partner stops fighting for the relationship, the avoidant confronts the possibility that they are not worth fighting for, that their value in their partner's life was not significant enough to sustain the effort indefinitely, that their presence provided insufficient reward for the emotional labor required to maintain connection with someone determined to avoid authentic intimacy through defensive strategies and emotional distance. The absence of fighting also forces the avoidant to confront their own emotional passivity and their expectation that relationships should require minimal effort from them while demanding maximum effort from their partners. They discover that their strategy of receiving love while avoiding the vulnerability of giving it creates unsustainable dynamics that eventually exhaust even the most patient and understanding partners. Understanding this moment reveals why it often triggers panic and desperation in the avoidant, who suddenly realizes they must either learn to fight for the relationship themselves or accept its loss, options that feel equally terrifying because fighting would require vulnerability, while losing would confirm their deepest fears about being ultimately unlovable and unworthy of sustained effort from others. The tragedy lies in how the avoidant's defensive strategies systematically train their partners to stop fighting by consistently demonstrating that such fighting produces no meaningful change, no authentic reciprocity, no genuine progress toward mutual intimacy and emotional connection. They create their own abandonment by making love feel like a losing battle that their partners eventually choose to stop fighting rather than continue losing indefinitely. The avoidant's shock at real consequences. The avoidant experiences genuine shock when their defensive behaviors finally produce irreversible consequences, rather than the temporary relationship turbulence they've learned to navigate through emotional distance and strategic withdrawal. Having spent months or years managing relationship crises without losing their partner permanently, they've developed the dangerous illusion that their emotional unavailability carries no real risk, that their systematic undermining of intimacy will be perpetually forgiven by someone too attached to enforce meaningful boundaries or consequences. This shock emerges from the avoidant's profound miscalculation about their partner's breaking point, having assumed that someone who loved them deeply would continue accepting minimal emotional investment indefinitely, rather than recognizing that even the most patient and understanding people eventually reach limits beyond which continued participation becomes psychologically destructive. They mistake their partner's long suffering for unlimited tolerance rather than recognizing it as finite resource that can be depleted. Understanding this shock means recognizing that the avoidant has been operating under the false assumption that their partner's love provides them with permanent immunity from relationship consequences, that their emotional unavailability will be consistently overlooked by someone who sees their potential rather than accepting their reality. They've confused their partner's capacity to forgive with their willingness to enable indefinitely. The shock intensifies when the avoidant realizes their usual crisis. Management techniques have no effect on someone who has genuinely moved beyond caring about their approval, attention, or presence in their life. Their strategic emotional distance, which once generated desperate pursuit, now generates nothing. Their calculated unavailability, which once created artificial scarcity, now creates actual absence that their former partner has learned to fill with sources of satisfaction that don't include them. This moment often represents the avoidant's first encounter with accountability for their emotional choices, forcing them to confront that their defensive strategies carry real costs that cannot be indefinitely absorbed by partners willing to sacrifice their own needs for someone incapable of reciprocal emotional investment. They discover that emotional immunity is temporary rather than permanent, contingent rather than guaranteed. The shock also includes the devastating recognition that their partner's departure represents rational choice rather than emotional overreaction, that someone who once fought desperately for their attention has concluded that continued investment serves no productive purpose. This realization eliminates their ability to dismiss their partner's decision as temporary emotional instability that will resolve once feelings cool and perspective returns. Most significantly, the shock forces the avoidant to confront their own emotional negligence and its cumulative impact on someone who provided consistent care, understanding, and patience while receiving minimal reciprocity and systematic emotional withholding in return. They must acknowledge that their defensive patterns didn't protect the relationship, but destroyed it through slow-motion emotional starvation of someone whose needs they consistently minimized. The consequences shock reveals the avoidant's fundamental misunderstanding of how healthy relationships operate, exposing their belief that love should require minimal maintenance while providing maximum security, that emotional investment should be one-sided rather than mutual, that their defensive strategies could indefinitely prevent intimacy without preventing connection entirely. Understanding this shock explains why it often triggers desperate attempts to restore the relationship through sudden emotional availability that feels manipulative rather than authentic to partners who have already processed the loss and moved toward acceptance. The consequences have already been internalized, while the avoidant is just beginning to recognize they exist. The cruel irony lies in how the avoidant's shock at consequences represents their recognition that they always possessed the capacity to provide what their partner needed, but chose not to until it was too late to matter, revealing that their emotional limitations were choices rather than disabilities, preferences rather than incapacities that could justify their systematic emotional withholding and relationship neglect. The final test that destroys everything. The avoidance final test typically arrives when their partner has reached their emotional limit, but hasn't yet left the relationship, creating what the avoidant perceives as an opportunity to reassert control through one last demonstration of their power to withdraw, withhold, or emotionally punish someone who has dared to question their treatment or demand better reciprocity. This final test represents the avoidant's ultimate miscalculation as they interpret their partner's vulnerability and last-ditch effort to save the relationship as permission to deliver the emotional blow that will definitively prove their superiority and control. This destructive test often manifests as the avoidant's cruelest behavior precisely when their partner is most emotionally raw and desperate for connection, when someone who has exhausted themselves trying to bridge the emotional gap finally asks directly for the love, consistency, or commitment they've been implicitly providing without receiving in return. The avoidant responds to this vulnerable request not with compassion, but with their most devastating withdrawal, their coldest indifference, their most calculated emotional cruelty. Understanding this final test means recognizing it as the avoidant's attempt to permanently establish that they cannot be controlled, influenced, or changed by their partner's emotional needs, that their autonomy remains absolute regardless of the pain such autonomy causes someone who has invested everything in loving them. They choose this moment to demonstrate their ultimate independence from their partner's feelings, needs, and desperate attempts to save what they both once valued. The test typically involves the avoidant doing or saying something so emotionally devastating that it cannot be forgiven, forgotten, or rationalized away by even the most understanding partner. This might include explicit rejection of their partner's worth, casual cruelty about their deepest insecurities, or deliberate betrayal designed to prove that their partner's love has no power to influence their behavior or create obligation for basic human decency and respect. This final destructive act serves multiple functions for the avoidant. It eliminates the uncomfortable pressure of their partner's emotional needs. It reasserts their control over the relationship dynamic. It proves they cannot be changed or influenced by someone else's love. And it forces their partner to finally give up hope for the connection they've been desperately trying to create through patience, understanding, and emotional generosity. The test becomes most destructive when it targets their partner's core vulnerabilities with surgical precision, revealing how much attention the avoidant has been paying to their partner's emotional landscape despite their pretense of indifference. They use intimate knowledge gained through months or years of emotional sharing to inflict maximum psychological damage, weaponizing their partner's trust and vulnerability against them. Most tragically, this final test usually occurs when their partner has already begun the internal process of letting go, when they've started to accept that the relationship cannot provide what they need and have begun preparing themselves psychologically for departure. The avoidance cruelty at this moment serves to accelerate and finalize a process that was already underway, ensuring there can be no reconsideration or second thoughts. The destructive nature of this test lies in how it eliminates any possibility of future reconciliation by crossing lines that cannot be uncrossed, saying things that cannot be unsaid, creating wounds that cannot heal even if the avoidant later recognizes their mistake and attempts to repair the damage they've deliberately inflicted on someone whose only crime was loving them despite their emotional limitations. Understanding this pattern reveals why the final test often surprises the avoidant with its effectiveness. They expect their partner to endure this cruelty as they've endured previous emotional abuse, not recognizing that they've finally found their partner's absolute breaking point and crossed it with malicious intent rather than defensive fear. The test ultimately destroys everything because it forces their partner to see the avoidant's true character. Someone capable of deliberate cruelty towards someone who has shown them nothing but love. Someone willing to inflict pain for the sake of proving their power. Someone whose emotional limitations extend beyond inability into willful destruction of what others hold sacred and valuable. When love transforms into indifference, the transformation of love into indifference represents the most devastating defeat the avoidant can experience because it eliminates their ability to maintain any form of connection or control over someone who once organized their entire emotional world around securing the avoidant's attention and approval. Unlike anger or resentment, which still indicate emotional investment and the possibility of eventual reconciliation, indifference signals complete emotional detachment that cannot be manipulated, influenced, or reversed through the avoidant's usual tactics of strategic withdrawal and calculated emotional availability. This transformation occurs not through conscious decision but through psychological self-preservation, as their partner's nervous system finally adapts to the reality that emotional safety cannot be found with someone whose primary relationship strategy involves creating emotional danger through systematic withholding and deliberate undermining of connection attempts. Love dies not through betrayal or conflict, but through slow starvation, eventually reaching a point where continued investment feels masochistic rather than generous. Understanding this transformation means recognizing that it represents the partner's psychological evolution from someone who believes they can love an avoidant into emotional health to someone who accepts that healing requires willing participation from the wounded person. The love doesn't transform into hatred, but simply evaporates, leaving behind the kind of neutral regard typically reserved for distant acquaintances rather than former intimate partners. The indifference manifests through the partner's complete cessation of emotional reactivity to the avoidant's behavior, mood, or presence, creating a psychological void where intense feeling once existed. The avoidant discovers they can no longer provoke responses through withdrawal, cannot generate pursuit through distance, cannot create the familiar dynamic of emotional hunger and strategic feeding that has characterized their relationship pattern throughout their adult life. This transformation becomes most evident when the avoidant realizes their former partner feels nothing when seeing them, experiences no emotional activation when hearing their name, shows no interest in their well-being or activities, and demonstrates complete emotional neutrality where passionate attachment once existed. The absence of feeling creates a psychological mirror that reflects back the avoidant's own emotional emptiness with devastating clarity. The indifference eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain their sense of importance in their former partner's life, forcing them to confront their own replaceability and the finite nature of even the most patient love when consistently mishandled and undervalued. They discover that their emotional unavailability has not created permanent attachment, but rather systematic detachment that eventually reaches completion through their own choices and behaviors. Most devastatingly, the transformation occurs without announcement or ceremony, often noticed by the avoidant only when they attempt to re-engage their former partner and discover that their presence generates no emotional response whatsoever. Their attempts at reconciliation, manipulation, or even casual contact are met with polite but genuine disinterest that signals complete psychological disconnection. The love to indifference transformation also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain their victim narrative about demanding, clingy, or emotionally unstable partners, as someone who no longer cares cannot be characterized as excessively needy or inappropriately attached. Their former partner's emotional neutrality removes their justification for defensive strategies while highlighting their own ongoing emotional dysfunction. Understanding this transformation reveals why it often triggers the avoidant's most desperate and pathetic behavior, as they suddenly realize they've lost not just a person, but their primary source of emotional significance and validation. Someone who once found them irresistibly compelling now finds them completely ordinary. Someone who once fought for their attention now distributes that attention to more deserving recipients. The transformation ultimately represents the complete success of the avoidant's defensive strategies. They have successfully prevented intimate connection, eliminated emotional vulnerability, and maintained their independence while discovering that such success feels exactly like devastating failure when measured against their actual human needs for love, connection, and the security that comes from being genuinely valued by another person. Their desperate last-minute awakening. The avoidant's awakening to what they've lost typically arrives with devastating clarity only after their partner has completed the psychological process of letting go, when the window for meaningful reconciliation has closed, and their sudden recognition of the relationship's value serves only to intensify their suffering rather than create opportunities for repair. This last-minute awakening represents the cruelest irony of avoidant attachment. They finally understand what they had precisely when they can no longer have it, finally recognize their partner's worth when that recognition can no longer influence outcomes. This awakening often strikes like psychological lightning, illuminating the full scope of their loss with painful precision as they realize they've destroyed the best relationship they're likely to ever experience through their own defensive choices and emotional cowardice. The person they took for granted reveals themselves as irreplaceable, the love they minimized appears invaluable, the connection they systematically undermined emerges as the most meaningful experience of their adult life, all at the moment when such recognition serves no constructive purpose. Understanding this awakening means recognizing that it emerges not from emotional growth but from panic about loss, not from genuine appreciation, but from desperate possessiveness, triggered by the reality that someone they considered permanently available has become permanently unavailable. The awakening represents reactive desperation rather than proactive evolution, crisis response rather than conscious development of their capacity for authentic intimacy and emotional reciprocity. The last-minute nature of this recognition reveals the avoidant's fundamental inability to appreciate what they possess while they possess it, their psychological requirement for loss or threat of loss to access authentic feelings about relationships they've spent months or years systematically devaluing. They can only recognize value through absence, understand love through its withdrawal, appreciate connection through its destruction. This awakening typically manifests through frantic attempts to communicate insights they should have developed months or years earlier, desperate declarations of feelings they should have expressed, when such expressions could have built rather than destroyed intimacy, and promises of changes they should have made when their partner still possessed the emotional resources to believe in their capacity for transformation rather than protective cynicism about their motivations. The desperation becomes most pathetic when the avoidant tries to use their newfound understanding as leverage for reconciliation, expecting their partner to be grateful for insights that arrive only under extreme pressure, rather than recognizing that awareness without previous action proves the voluntary nature of their emotional withholding. Their awakening highlights their selfishness rather than demonstrating their growth. Most tragically, the last-minute awakening often includes accurate assessment of their own emotional limitations and destructive patterns, revealing that they always possessed the self-awareness necessary for change, but lacked the motivation to pursue such change when it could have preserved rather than attempted to restore their most important relationship. Their clarity about their problems serves only to emphasize their responsibility for their consequences. The awakening also forces the avoidant to confront the reality that their defensive strategies were choices rather than compulsions, that their emotional unavailability reflected preferences rather than disabilities, that they systematically chose protection over connection when healthier choices remained available. This recognition eliminates their ability to maintain victim narratives about their attachment wounds, while highlighting their agency in relationship destruction. Understanding this pattern explains why last-minute awakenings often fail to achieve their intended goal of relationship restoration, as partners who have completed the process of letting go recognize these insights as crisis-driven rather than growth-motivated, temporary rather than sustainable, reactive rather than reflecting genuine character development that would prevent similar patterns in future relationships. Why the breaking point is always too late. The breaking point arrives too late because it represents the natural conclusion of the avoidant's own systematic destruction of their partner's capacity to hope, trust, and invest emotionally in someone who has consistently demonstrated their inability to reciprocate such investment with authentic vulnerability and sustained emotional presence. By the time the avoidant recognizes what they're losing, their partner has already completed the psychological work of accepting that loss and rebuilding their life around sources of satisfaction that don't depend on someone incapable of genuine intimacy. The timing becomes tragic because the avoidant's recognition of their partner's value coincides precisely with their partner's recognition that continued investment serves no productive purpose, that loving someone who cannot love back represents a form of self that must end for their psychological survival. The awakening occurs when its recipient has already moved beyond caring about the awakener's belated insights and desperate promises of transformation. Understanding why it's always too late means recognizing that the breaking point represents the completion of their partner's grief process rather than its beginning, the end of their hope rather than a crisis that might restore it. Their partner has already mourned the relationship they wanted, accepted the relationship they actually had, and made peace with the reality that some people cannot provide what healthy partnerships require, regardless of how much they're loved or how patiently they're supported. The lateness stems from the avoidant's fundamental inability to recognize value while possessing it, their psychological requirement for crisis to access authentic feelings, their defensive programming that prevents appreciation until threat of loss overrides their attachment fears. They can only love freely when such freedom can no longer preserve what they're desperate to keep, can only offer vulnerability when it can no longer create the intimacy they've spent the relationship avoiding. This timing represents the avoidant's ultimate punishment for their emotional cowardice. They must watch someone they desperately need walk away with dignity intact while they collapse into the very emotional chaos their defensive strategies were designed to prevent. Their attempt to avoid vulnerability through emotional distance creates exactly the vulnerability they feared most: complete powerlessness to prevent loss of someone essential to their well-being. The breaking point arrives too late because it requires the partner's complete emotional detachment to trigger the avoidant's recognition of their attachment, their total indifference to provoke acknowledgement of their partner's importance, their absolute departure to force admission of feelings that could have preserved the relationship if expressed when preservation remained possible, rather than serving only to intensify suffering after destruction was complete. Most tragically, the lateness ensures that the avoidance awakening becomes a form of emotional torture rather than relationship salvation, forcing them to experience their deepest attachment feelings towards someone who can no longer be moved by such feelings, to offer their most authentic vulnerability to someone who has learned to protect themselves from precisely such manipulation disguised as growth. The breaking point's inevitable lateness also serves as the avoidance education in the finite nature of human patience and love, teaching them that emotional resources can be depleted, that goodwill can be exhausted, that even the most generous hearts eventually close when consistently mishandled and undervalued by someone too frightened of intimacy to reciprocate the very love they desperately need but systematically destroy. Understanding this timing reveals the cruel justice in the avoidant's fate. They lose what they value most through their own choices, experience their worst fears through their own actions, and discover their deepest needs precisely when those needs can no longer be met by the person best equipped to meet them, but no longer willing to sacrifice themselves for someone who chose emotional safety over authentic connection, until such choice eliminated both safety and connection entirely.